in here. This is, for me, a very exciting time because I get to introduce to you the recipient of this year's Cox Center Humanitarian Award. Now, this award was established 10 years ago, and since it was established, it has been given to the foremost people that have contributed to advancing global justice. So last year, we had Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I have the list in front of me. I just need to name these other people. A lot of you have been here to watch them during their speeches. But we started out with Hans Corell, who was the UN legal advisor. Then we had Philippe Kirsch, who was the first president and also the chairman of the drafting committee of the International Criminal Court. We had Luis Moreno Ocampo, who was the first prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Robert Petit, who was the international prosecutor of the Cambodia Khmer Rouge Genocide Tribunal. We had Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We had Brenda Hollis, the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and Stephen Rapp, the US Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues. Now, this is a first because all of these folks are lawyers, and this is a law school. The general has done many things in his life, but he didn't go to law school. Yet, I was on a panel with him at Dalhousie last summer, which you've heard about, and I found him to be legally very sharp, very creative, and best of all, extremely down to earth. And I felt like I really bonded with him, and I said, that's the guy I want to nominate for this award. He has done so much to deserve the award, and so our faculty, which votes every year and picks this award, which has now been called the Cleveland version of the Nobel Peace Prize, unanimously selected General Dallaire. Now, yeah. Now, General Dallaire, as seen in some portrait that I stole from the internet, is there probably in his glory when he was force commander in Rwanda. And anybody, well, let me ask, who here saw the movie Hotel Rwanda? A lot, like everybody almost. If you haven't seen it, just go on YouTube, you can watch it. Nick Nolte, who is not as good looking as General Dallaire, played the general, and he did amazing in the part. And you got a sense, I think, of what the general was facing during the genocide in Rwanda when the international community would not answer his call to give him the authority to stop the bloodshed. Now, since then, he has left the military, and he is now a senator from Canada, so I should be calling Senator Dallaire. And he's also a best-selling author. His two books, one is Shake Hands with the Devil, and that is sort of an international indictment of the international community's failure to stop the bloodshed in Rwanda and other places around the world. We say never again, but it's really ever and ever again, and that's why people like General Dallaire are so important to keep reminding us of that. And then his most recent book is They Fight Like Soldiers, They Die Like Children, and this is his contribution to the dialogue on child soldiers. And you've heard that he's created the Child Soldiers Initiative, and Shelley works with him on that, and it's literally changing the perception of this issue of child soldiers, so much so that you don't only see costumes on the internet, I understand, but you see serious discussion about this issue. Well, last year, that discussion morphed into also a discussion of child pirates. And you had a warm-up act by this panel, but I think General Dallaire will be returning to that theme as well. Can you come on up and so we can present you with the 2013 Cox Center Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. And I'm told I have to face the camera when I present this to you. And now we're going to have a speech by General Dallaire. I don't know, are you going to also have some question and answer at the end? Or?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Do you want to speak from up here?
Yes.
Then it's time for you to do so. There's a bottle of water, and the audience is yours.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Imagine telling a politician to face the camera. I'm always a bit tongue-in-cheek. I laugh when people ask me if they can take a picture with me, and I said, what politician do you know that doesn't want his picture taken? And so I'm flattered for that opportunity, and also for those who are watching us streaming on the web. But first, thank you very much for, one, the invitation to be able to address you as a layperson and not from the legal background, although I have chaired a number of court-martials and thrown a bunch of people in jail in my time, but as a commander, not necessarily from the pure JAG side of the House, or Judge Advocate General, or legal side. And secondly, thank you very much for the Frederick K. Cox International Center Award, and also the funds that are so attached that are going directly into our research work at Dalhousie. And so thank you very much for permitting us to continue to do our work. I think that if I may, I'll try to watch the clock so that we do have time for question and answers, and I probably would like to stay longer, but our leader here has got us lined up with NPR, so I don't think we'll be able to play with those timings. So I think that, first of all, I'd like to say that I consider it quite risky for an American institution to invite so many Canucks or Canadians down here, particularly in this time frame when we are in Canada celebrating the War of 1812 and you are commemorating it. We know we won it, so we don't have much problems with that, but we don't really like rubbing the noses of our friendly colleagues on that. It adds an interesting link, though, to the discussions or today, because there was quite a naval component to that war, if you remember, mostly on the Great Lakes. And there was some piracy done, of course, by your side, not ours. And so I tend to like some of the anecdotal history of the War of 1812, because, as an example, the farthest north you actually made it was to attack and burn a fort called York, which ultimately is Toronto. I'm from Montreal, that doesn't bother me much, but we thought we'd do you a favor and come down south, and we found this town built on a swamp, and it was hot and it was humid and there was lots of mosquitoes, and so we thought we'd burn it down and do you a favor, and what you do, you rebuild it. It's Washington. So we're not too sure who really understood how to win a complex war even in that era. I'm here also in a scenario that is not totally foreign to me in regards to trying to establish some naval credentials. I am an artillery officer by my profession of arms, but I am a graduate of your U.S. Marine Corps Staff College, and so I spent a year with Marines and afloat, and have served with a number of them over the years. It was interesting that during my year there in my syndicate, there was a naval P-3 pilot, you know, the anti-submarine aircraft that you have, and we have the same one, who wrote a paper on how to bring naval gunfire back into the diplomatic arena by creating lightweight 8-inch guns on destroyers. And so it was interesting to see a pilot pull that out, and that made me quite warm to him, because as an artillery officer, I was also trained on naval gunfire. However, since we've gotten rid of the big guns, I think that that's been quite a downer for us who love the Navy and respect that tradition and that service significantly. Back home, we call it the senior service, and it rightly deserves that title. Because we're talking child pirates and child soldiers, I decided to wear my a bit gaudy tie, which is my UNICEF tie today, as UNICEF is one of those frontline NGOs very much involved in this arena, as they are included also in Somalia, where we're doing some work with them, and have been heavily involved on the child soldier, but on the demobilization, rehabilitation, reintegration side of the House, which I will argue is a way of handling the problem, but it is not necessarily reducing its impact. Picking up the pieces afterwards is not necessarily stopping its use. And so I will get into where I think we can be far more effective in the preventive side of the House, which ultimately, I hope, takes away a weapons platform from the inventory of conflict or use in other realms, including, as an example, piracy, banditry, and similar activities. I nearly forgot that two of my children are in the Naval Reserve, but I'm saved by the fact that my eldest son is in the infantry. But so we'll continue. In regards to today, I'm going to be a bit constrained by two factors. The first one is I'm not using PowerPoint, or for those who are more modern, with Apple Keynote. And the second one is I was asked to be relatively brief, and brevity is not the strength of retired generals nor politicians, particularly if you want time for questions, which I hope we will have a dynamic exercise in so doing. I also want to tell you that I come from a country that is at times talking from both sides of its mouth, which makes it rather difficult to be credible here at this podium and many others in the international sphere in these days, because on the one hand, Canada was leading, as with the United States, in moving the optional protocol on child rights, as an example, in regards to child soldiers and the recognition thereof. But on the other hand, refused to repatriate a child soldier from Guantanamo Bay who was Canadian and in fact was ultimately dumped in Canada after he was tried in Guantanamo and is now in a Canadian jail. And it was interesting, we just fleetingly touched upon one of our speakers on child terrorism, and there was a heated debate back home on whether or not this 15-year-old who had been taken to Afghanistan by his dad, who was very close to the Al-Qaeda hierarchy, 4 years indoctrinated over there, and at the age of 15 ended up in a firefight, and in so doing was accused of killing an American soldier. He was shot twice in the back, 2 years held in prison, where some of the people who imprisoned him were ultimately court-martialed for having killed other prisoners, and then held in 7 years without trial, and then did a plea bargaining to 8 more years of jail in maximum jail back home in Canada, finally. And so there was significant debate whether or not Omar Khadr was a child soldier or was he a child terrorist, and does that change all the rules of the exercise? And I have been quite adamant in that throwing the catalyst of terrorism to a 15-year-old engaged in a conflict does not override the optional protocol on child rights. And I still consider that individual a child soldier, and I'd be happy to see if the debate is as interesting down here as it has been up north. Now, there has been, as establishing some of the parameters that we've discussed this morning, and particularly with the last panel, a significant debate on age, a significant debate on voluntarism, and so on. And we've shared panels, Mark, before on this fund, and I want to bring an angle to this discussion. I want to bring the angle to the question of not the age, because it's a reference point, and it's interesting that we in our military do not permit people to be recruited, trained, and particularly used in operations under the age of 18, although our military academies do recruit under 18, but they don't deploy under 18. And yet we have problems accepting that that is a criteria that can be used in other countries for youths who are engaged in conflicts. But it's the volunteerism side. And the link I make comes from my Rwandan experience as the force commander. At one point, there were elements of my force that were very much engaged, if I can use that term, in fraternization with the locals. And Rwanda was a country that was imploding. Rwanda was a country that was in conflict and ultimately went into a civil war and genocide. And so this country in conflict, you had these foreign troops coming in and fraternizing with the locals. And the question was, does that actually stand a test of ethical responsiveness by military or forces coming into a conflict zone? Should fraternization be accepted? And so a debate, very short one, I must say, because within the military we don't have to debate too long. So the debate was, well, they're sort of voluntarily, these women are presenting themselves to these soldiers. And so, yes, the fraternization can be recognized as possible and acceptable. I, however, came down and said, there is no such thing as fraternization in a conflict zone. Women do not voluntarily give themselves to men of foreign forces or coming in because they're fallen in love. They're doing it because they need security, they're doing it because they need money, they need food, they need protection. And so there are a whole series of parameters that surround, that create the atmosphere that have permitted this action to happen. And so I put a whole bunch of places out of bounds, and I prevented and took action against those who did fraternize in Rwanda with either side. I look at child soldiers and I say, is it possible that you can actually argue volunteerism in a country in conflict, in an imploding nation, with youths? Is there really that free atmosphere permitting them to actually define volunteerism the same way we do under the context of where we are here, where we volunteer to join the forces, we volunteer to join an organization? Is it the same? And I would argue that it's not. And I would go as far as to argue that no matter how they get into the recruitment of whatever the force, be it a national body, be it a non-state actor, or be it a belligerent of whatever type, including piracy gangs and so on, that youth do not volunteer in those nations where we know the whole atmosphere is one of a failing state where rule of law probably doesn't even, is not even applied, let alone the sense of security that the families or the individuals find themselves in. And I will argue that also that it is still a vulnerable body that's there within the youth, even at 16 and 17, that can be induced into the extremes. And the example I would like to use is the example not of Sierra Leone, and of course knowing that that war was fought by, on all sides, youths and the exactions that they conducted and so on. And I applaud the International Tribunal of Sierra Leone that did not prosecute child soldiers. But I will bring you back again, if I may, to Rwanda. I mean, we're in the 20th anniversary year of that genocide. And how a political party used the radio, and a great radio station, great music, great attachment was created by this radio station that was funded by this political party, how it brought in a youth movement within its party. It gave them uniforms, it organized soccer games, it organized Sunday activities for them. It gave them a sense of a certain empowerment and joining a club and so on. and how they, in less than a year, were able to change that group from being a youth movement of fraternity and collegiality and learning and esprit de corps and so on, into the primary weapon system used in the genocide, into a militia that, with machetes, slaughtered the bulk of the Rwandans in that genocide. And they were under 18, a lot of them, not even counting those who were part of the two fighting forces that had under 18 child soldiers on both sides fighting in the conflict. But then you had the Interamwe, as they were called, behind the lines, conducting all the slaughtering under orders, under influence by that same extremist political party, the CDR, that ultimately was held accountable in the International Tribunal. So we're talking very much of still an entity that can be maneuvered, and can be maneuvered to incredible extremes, and be used very effectively. And so that is why I, apart from the fact that I had a child soldier AK-47 stuffed up one of my nostrils with his finger on the trigger, and the only reason to this day I believe he didn't pull the trigger is he saw the chocolate bar in my hand. Apart from that, I feel that this child soldier dimension, this introduction of youths into piracy, as we're doing, and other endeavors as we're seeing youth being engaged in, is, in my opinion, a dimension of conflict that is of our era, particularly as it came extensively with the Mozambique conflict in the late 80s, came available because of massive availability or proliferation of small arms that also helped at the end of the Cold War. We didn't destroy all those stuff, all those weapons. We sold them off, and they're readily available. But it came, in my opinion, as an introduction of not a social economic problem in conflicts, but in fact as a new weapon system. And so I argue that in fact we've seen the introduction of a new weapon system that is the primary weapon system in many conflicts around the world. So it's not just your drummer boy of the 19th century or your press gang youth on naval ships, you know, in also the 19th century. It's not in a sort of an extreme scenario as the Hitler Youth were used at the end of the World War II campaign, and we've seen them used at different scenarios, and we saw Cambodia and so on. But we are talking about children, youth being used as the primary weapon system that adults are using to conduct their conflict and their campaigns. And as such, I have looked at child soldiers and the work we're doing as, in fact, how do you not pick up the pieces afterwards? That is to say, how do you demobilize them? And how do you rehabilitate them? And how do you reintegrate them as such? Well, I'll come back to that. But look at how do you stop them being used? How do you neutralize this weapon system in the conflict? How do you make child soldiers, or now child pirates, a liability to the adults so that they won't recruit them and they won't use them? And how, as you are facing them in these conflicts, that you look at them as a security problem, and as such your security forces, working with NGOs and development people, are able to bring together solutions in trying to neutralize them without slaughtering them. For the doctrines of all forces out there, and when I started my work when I was at the Kennedy School in 2004, we did an extensive survey of all military forces, developed countries and non-developed countries, in their doctrine in regards to child soldiers. And nobody had anything except my good friends, the U.S. Marine Corps. And what they had was one slide on one course in regards to if they are deployed as a force, and should they by chance meet up with child soldiers or youths armed as part of the belligerent forces, that they should do everything to avoid confrontation. That was the doctrine. Well, how do you do that when the primary enemy force is child soldiers? And how do you end up doing anything else than ultimately trying to prevent their effectiveness, trying also to protect yourself and your mission, and ultimately using the fundamental law of self-defense in blowing them away? And so that's what's out there. That's what was out there. And in so doing, has not, in my opinion, attenuated the use of children. It has simply tried to attenuate the impact of the use of children subsequently. Meaning that the emphasis up until we started to treat this as a weapon system, and ultimately how do we prevent them from being recruited in the first place, that the emphasis being on demobilizing them, rehabilitating, reintegrating them, simply did nothing to reduce the scale or the numbers. It simply found ways of hopefully picking up the pieces and attempting to bring them back to a certain normalcy. But even there, we saw that that did not necessarily achieve the aim, because what is more precious than a child soldier in many of these conflicts? It is a child soldier veteran. The re-recruitment of child soldiers. In the piracy scenario, we're trying to pick up the metrics of how many times these kids are going back into the process. An experienced child soldier is worth a fortune. And so we're into the children who are being moved between countries. As we saw, a number of Sierra Leone ex-child soldiers find themselves all of a sudden in Côte d'Ivoire, fighting. A number from Liberia also ended up in Côte d'Ivoire. We've seen some who have even been moved into the Mali operations not that long ago. And so re-recruitment is a concern, because they are very effective. They've experienced, and they are worth their weight in gold to those who use them. But then, as you bring your attention to preventing re-recruitment, of course, there is one angle that has not been touched on. And this is the child soldier leader. So far, we've spent a lot of time discussing that adults are actually giving the orders and running these youths in whatever operations they're doing. But there are a significant number of child soldier leaders. This is the 14, 15-year-old going on 25, who's already been in operations for 3 years, who's commanded up to 50 kids, who youths older than him show deference to him or her, and in so doing has gained this incredible experience, and also this strength of prestance or presence in the individual's own ability to lead, the power, empowerment it has, that they cannot simply be demobilized and thrown in with the rest of the kids to go back to grade 1 with the rest of them as he's 14 or 15 and learn Dick and Jane when this kid has been running operations for the last couple of years. And so what happens to them? They become very rapidly disenchanted with the opportunities and what they are getting, the treatment they're getting. They don't have any of the advantages that they did have even as leaders, and so they go and influence those same other kids and haul them right back into the field. And you have the source of a continuum of the conflict by continuing to keep this system going. And ultimately, if the conflict is over, there's nothing that prevents them from going to banditry and God knows what other means. And so why have we not looked at this child soldier leader and built a program, as we do in our schools, in our high schools? We have high schools, a number of them, who have in their motto leadership, right? Leaders of tomorrow, and so on. Right outside this building, it's influencing the leaders, right? So why not create these types of schools in a conflict zone? Take Sierra Leone with the thousands that were used. There may have been maybe 300-400 at most of child soldier leaders different. Why not create a school Give them a 4-year program. Re-indoctrinate them to become leaders for the nation, to maximize that extraordinary potential that they've already been exercising, and shift it to moving the country forward, instead of leaving it fester there and ultimately haul the whole system back down, and all those investments in rehabilitation, reintegration are for naught. So, with that being said, the question is how do we handle this scenario of the child soldier, the piracy situation, and I'm very much looking at not just the child pirate who's being blown away on the water, but I'm very much looking at the child pirate on land, where they're being recruited, where they're being trained, where they're being influenced, where the families are engaged or not, and where they are being influenced. I'm looking at that side as I'm looking at other conflict zones, as we've recently come back from the eastern Congo, the Kivu, the Ituri, northern Congo, the South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, where with the U.S. forces out of AFRICOM, we're in there looking at how they're handling CONI and how they're handling that whole concept of use of children. And one of the angles that caught us quite by surprise as we were doing our assessment on the ground and meeting with commanders and browbeating some of these rebel commanders into near insulting scenarios, where I remember taking on one very pretentious commander, a Mau Mau, who to the question I asked, well, do you have child soldiers? No, we don't recruit child soldiers. Do you have girls amongst your organization, young girls who are used as porters or whatever? Oh, no, we don't use girls. Knowing full well that about 40% of all child soldiers are girls. And when I was in Sierra Leone in 2001, I was demobilizing 10 boys for every girl, because girls are far more useful than boys. They're not only up front doing exactly what the boys are doing, and very capably doing that, but in those male-dominated societies, they're also running all the bivouacs and all the logistics, and they're the sex slaves and bushwives of the commanders. So they're far more precious to these guys than the boys are. But in going into the field and meeting this commander, and so at the end of the discussion with this commander who said he didn't have them, and then we showed him that we saw some of his forces that were used, that he was using in the Kivu area against the ex-Rwandan extremists. And we said, you're using them, there, look at this. And then he would sort of acknowledge it. But then, as an ex-commander, I turned to him and I said, how is it that you need kids to fight your fight? How is it that you can't recruit adults to fight your fight? How is it that you can actually consider yourself a commander by having children, youth, do your fighting for you? And by browbeating and insulting, you have two options that end up at the end of that. One, you get your head blown off, or the other one, that you might have influenced him enough to bring him down from his pretentious position, insulted enough to maybe undermine his command, and if you're lucky, then again, you might be able to sneak out, and hopefully he's not being replaced by somebody who will continue to recruit him. So in the realm of this world of use of children, the essence, in my belief, in regards to, so what do? We keep it going? It is not necessarily, and I would argue, and this is very risky for me, being the first recipient of the Cleveland Nobel Peace Prize, and not being a lawyer, to tell a whole room of legal people that maybe your answer ain't enough. And I think that was raised also earlier on, that it's just not enough. Because what have we seen so extensively, if we don't account for all the NGO work done on demobilization, rehabilitation, and so on? What else have we seen? We have seen a lot of work done at the UN with special representatives on war-affected children. We've seen the naming and shaming of countries. We've seen going into countries and holding some of the national bodies accountable for the use. We've seen a lot of that. But we haven't really seen the forces that are deployable and being deployed actually influencing the battle, actually influencing the scenario. Meaning, There are over 100,000 peacekeepers now deployed around the world in conflict zones where extensive use of child soldiers does exist. And so, what are they getting as training? How are they being prepared to face child soldiers? How are they looking at that problematic? What are the mandates that these missions are getting regarding child soldiers? What are, in fact, the concepts of operations that the military are to use, that the police are to use? How much are they working with the NGOs that are locally there who have enormous amount of information in regards to solving not the social economic problem, although it is a component of it, but this security problem? And that's where we are still horrifically deficient, in the training of those forces to be more proactive, to be able to anticipate facing it, to discern where the recruitment is going on, and how do you actually assist in preventing that recruitment, and how do you attenuate the impact of these child soldiers in the conflict zone by bringing together these multidisciplinary structures, or multidisciplinary structures of military, of police, the security side, the NGO side, the diplomats, the politicians, both the national ones and the foreign ones that are deployed, like the UN ones, in making the eradication of the use of children in the conflict of this weapon system as a primary focus of the mandate. We've gone through mandates way back. And only recently are we starting to see words that speak of child soldiers, even though the child soldiers are the dominant forces being deployed by often the non-state actors. And so I would argue that as we're working down trying to attrit the recruitment, the use of child soldiers, that on the one hand, more and more research information, more and more metrics, not all the anecdotal stuff that we're getting, which is so dominated, and the NGO world is so powerful in its anecdotal information. But you don't get policy changes from anecdotal information. You might get some advocacy and you might get a friendly political gesture, but you don't get fundamental policy from anecdotal. You need solid metrics. And that's why we brought this whole program into a university context where we'll get that intellectual rigor. We'll get that peer review of the data. So one of the things is go and find out exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how we can actually curtail it. So how do we counteract this weapon system? How do we neutralize it? I spent 4 years as the head of the Army Capital Acquisition Program. Bought billions of dollars worth of equipment. It was nearly simple compared to this because it was easy to identify what the countermeasure would have to be to face another weapon system. It was a tank. It's an anti-tank system, which might be another tank. It might be, God knows, a missile, but at least you could do that. What is the countermeasure to a child soldier that is other than simply killing, destroying? Not to say, as I'm ebbing with the time available, not to say that in extremis, even though I am a firm belief in the rights-based concepts of solutioning and evolving in the international sphere, I do accept the fact that in extremis we may find ourselves having to kill, destroy some children to achieve the mission. When you go around some of these extreme non-state actors and look at the ones that they've got around them and how their brains have been literally fried, how they are non-existent as human, they're humanoids, and the fanaticism around them, you will never get at that adult leadership without having to get through those kids. So in extremis, yeah, maybe we will have to. However, there are many other means of countermeasures. So one is getting hard data in countermeasures and then getting that data into policy and into mandates and then ultimately into operational concepts that can be used. Multidisciplinary by missions, by countries, alliances, be it the African Union or any of the sub-regions of the Africa or others, into the field. The second part of it is training. And I add education, particularly for the officer corps. Training and education of the security forces, particularly. Both the national ones, the ones coming in order to know what this threat is and discern and build the doctrinal basis needed to counteract it without having to use extreme force. And that training is extraordinarily rewarding because there's none going on. And when we go, as we are now been mandated for a 5-year program by the President of Sierra Leone, to retrain his whole army, retrain all his police force, retrain his prison guards who have children in their prisons. They don't know how to handle them. We even are mandated to go into the education system and to educate the youth on how to prevent being recruited, that you don't want to be a child soldier, that it's not a big ego trip and it's not empowerment, but it is in fact a probable sign of being destroyed. Well, that's to us the way to go about it, is moving that education and training into those nations where we've seen and seem to see that there is a cultural or facility maybe to use children and to make that abhorrent. And so I end by saying that my ultimate aim is to eradicate the use of youths as weapons of conflict, of war, piracy, drug wars in the favelas. When I was in Rio, I was in the favelas in Rio, and I saw as much fighting and as much conflict with those kids in those favelas, in those slums in Rio, that I saw in Africa. And so what we're doing there, we know we're going to be able to transfer into some of those drug war scenarios, be it Colombia, be it in Brazil and other places. And I'll indicate that I believe that we can even push it to another level in our own gang wars. We have been working with police and how they're handling the gang wars in North America and in Europe, and whether there's stuff that we can extract from that. But there is a fear, as an example, closer to home. The Aboriginal community. The Aboriginal community, as an example in our country, is the fastest growing community in the country. They are massively disenfranchised. What they have now that they didn't have before is the social communications media to be able to coalesce. Why they've never been effective is because they've never been able to get together. They now have that tool. And there's enough of them educated, and there are enough weapons around this continent, and I say continent because we're just as bad, or nearly, in enough of these weapons available for them to become a force that could become a security problem. We've already had an insurrection in Canada in 1990. There's nothing that would prevent it as we see their demands not being met. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we have an ability to ultimately stop the use of a weapon system and neutralize it and make it a liability. The question is, do we want to look at it that way, or do we want to continue to find ways of simply picking up those pieces afterwards and hope that maybe the social economic side of the house will ultimately pick up, and that there will not be a scenario in which insecurity and the implosion of the nation and the vulnerability of the nation would make the requirement for recruiting children necessary in either state or non-state actors. And I believe we can achieve it. Might take 30 years. So what? What's 30 years if we can eliminate that from the world of conflict? Thank you very much. Yes, well, now that they've had their 2-minute break, we can do that. Certainly. I must forewarn you that brevity is not my strength either in responses, so we'll see how far we get. Anyone on any subject? I was on national news this morning on Syria, but that's another exercise. Sir.
Is the problem that you're talking about with children in Africa and so forth any different than the problem that we have in this country with bringing kids up from starting with preschool and education, and so that they don't become members of gangs in this country? Isn't that really the same? Isn't this the same type of issue? And shouldn't it be approached from the bottom up rather than from the top down?
In fact, permit me to respond with this example. I was in Edmonton, and I'll use, if I may, the Aboriginal community that's been fairly integrated there. And I went to a youth center, drop-in center, and all ages, my God, 7, 8 years old, including 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And it was wintertime, and it can be pretty cold up there as it is here. I was asked to stay a little longer after meeting with different youth groups and what they do and so on, because these 4 members of a youth gang wanted to meet with me. And so I waited, and they came in, and these 4 guys, they looked like they had been, defensive linemen out of the New England Patriots. I mean, they were humongous. And they were 15, 16. And so we sat down. And their question to me was, how do we get out of this? How do we get out of having to be in these gangs? How do we get out of being suckered in and then not being able to extract ourselves? How do we get out of it in trying to protect our sisters who are being used as prostitutes downtown, and we're protecting them against them being overly abused, if I can use the term, and the like. And so there is here at home a need for that consciousness of disenfranchisement will lead to recruitment into groups that can be cohesive, give them a sense of cohesion and even protection, or simply sucker them into that sense of empowerment, and ultimately they can't find a way out. In the favelas in Rio, the youth that I met, the last day I was there 5 days. And the last day I met with these youths, and they told me, there's only 2 ways of getting out of this sort of drug gang scenario. First, you got to recognize that the life expectancy is on average about 3 years in it. Secondly, however, to get out of it, there's 2 ways, either in a wood box or, in fact, with the Bible. And it was interesting that all of a sudden this whole dimension of spirituality came into play, and that the evangelicals have been doing enormous amount of work in hauling them out and protecting them. And so in our research, we've discovered that the spiritual side, the whole sort of voodoo and all the dimensions of the social cultural side of how they've used that to influence the kids, that they can be protected from being killed by